Joe Seeley is one of Canada's most distinguished jazz musicians. He's a pianist, a composer, an actor, a musical director, and a radio host of Joe's Jazz on Jazz FM in Toronto. He was born in Montreal, began his career in the late 50s in Quebec. He moved to Halifax in 1967, where his career flourished, and then moved back to Toronto in 1976. In 1997, he composed his magnum opus, Africville Suite, for which he won a Juno, and he was invested into the Order of Canada in 2010. Hi, Joe. Welcome to the CBMA podcast. How are you, sir?
I'm just terrific. Thank you. Glad we could finally connect.
Absolutely. I want to start with what seemingly is a high point of your career, and that is winning or being invested with an Order of Canada in 2010. Can I take you back to that? And what was it like when you got that phone call?
It was quite incredible, actually. I got a heads up that it might be coming, so it wasn't a total shock, But of course, when it did come in, I mean, that's reality, and I gratefully and humbly accepted the invitation. It was very exciting. I mean, I just wish my parents were alive to enjoy it too.
Yeah, you talk quite a bit, and we had the pleasure of having you perform with Jackie Richardson at our Black History Month celebration back in February. Mm-hmm. And you spoke about your dad in a very moving way, and you talked about Africville, even though you weren't born in Africville. Can you connect those two dots for the benefit of our audience?
Yeah, well, my dad was born in Africville, and as a matter of fact, he lived through the Great Halifax explosion, where the Mont Blanc collided with the Emo and blew up Halifax Harbor. He actually he got a piece of shrapnel in his head. Fortunately for him, Africville was on the other side of the hill. So basically most of the blast debris sort of flew over the community, but some of it landed on him. And he told that story of going to the nearest hospital to try to get some assistance for the wound that he had on his head, and going through the wondering why he couldn't get anybody's attention, and then noticing people lining the hallway, missing arms and legs, and it was a pretty devastating thing. And I guess at this point he realized he might as well go home and ask Mom to fix the wound on his head because he wasn't about to get much attention, in that environment.
And, I only learned about the Halifax explosion while I was working for CBC Television. I don't know how many people appreciated that over 2,000 people died at that time.
Well, it was quite very, very devastating, and let's face it, a warship carrying munitions colliding with another ship, and unfortunately the munitions were ignited, and it just had a devastating effect on the city. And, I guess the good thing about Africville was that there was a hill, and Africville was on the other side of the hill. So the devastation to the community, they didn't get a lot of damage, but, shrapnel did fall, and everybody knew what had happened. My dad, then of course this was in 1917, and in 1919 is when my grandparents decided to move to Montreal. And of course, he was brought up in Montreal from the time he was 10 years of age. But, in his heart, he always said that when he retired, he would like to return to Africville. But as everyone knows, by the time it was, he was retired, Africville no longer existed. It had been razed by the city. And let's face it, that was the end of that chapter of Canadian history.
Now, it seems to me that this album of yours, Africville Suite, has really had a great impact on your career. I see here where you've traveled to the US, you've traveled to Europe as well, performing, the music of Africville Suite. Where were some of these places?
Well, in the U.S., played Kansas City. I did a tour of Minnesota, Wisconsin. I played at the Canadian Embassy in Washington. It was then, and also at a festival in St. Louis, Upper New York. We played a lot of isolated universities and whatnot. I even performed at Duke University in North Carolina, so that was wonderful. And of course, in Europe, we played in Norway, in Oslo, and in Denmark, I played a lot of university or colleges in towns that I can hardly pronounce, but it was exciting to be there. But of course, the highlight was to play the House of Jazz in Copenhagen, where Miles Davis and a lot of great, American jazz musicians that performed, to be in that hallowed ground and see their pictures on the wall and to be in that environment was quite special.
Well, I've heard people compare Africville Suite to Wynton Marsalis's best album. And it seems to me you getting to play in Copenhagen's in that venue. I'm wondering how many Europeans would have been familiar with your music at the time.
Probably not too many. I mean, the internet was sort of in its early stages, and the only way they would have known about it is via the internet. Pardon me, and. But, it was certainly wonderful to perform it there, and the response was great. One of the towns actually had a choir that had done some vocal arrangements to a few of my pieces. So when we performed there, they said, can we, basically sing these pieces with you? It was really wonderful. And then on our last concert, which is in a totally different town, they actually traveled there to perform these pieces with us. They were so excited,
How cool was that?
Oh, I know. I mean, we went over there with no expectations and found it was a wonderful experience. People really gravitated to it.
Wow. Did you anticipate that? Because I've read, or at least I've heard, where there were 3 parts initially to Africville Suite, but then a number of people, including your late wife, kind of nudged you towards.
Yeah, well, what happened was I wrote a piece called Africville, which we recorded on an album, dual vision album with Paul Novotny, which was also nominated for a Juno. So we performed it at St. Mary's University in Halifax. And after the concert, I was approached by Irvin Carvery, who was the director of the Africville Genealogy Society, and Susan Hunter, who was the artistic director for the Halifax Jazz Festival. So first of all, Susan said, look, if you write more, Irvin said, you got to write more. And I said, well, Irvin, this piece is in 3 movements. It depicted the development, or the beginnings of the community, the life of the community, and the demise of the community. I mean, the piece took me about 11 minutes to play. I said, well, that's it. Beginning, middle, and end. What more is there? And he kept saying, no, you got to write more. You got to write more, And Susan Hunter chimed in and said, well, if you write more, we'll make it a headline piece at next year's Jazz Festival. So I basically, because I just couldn't grasp why they couldn't understand why there was no more to write, I dismissively said, yes, okay, And that's how the story developed. 6 months later, I had completely forgotten about it because, like I said, in my mind, there was no more to write, And then one day, my wife, out of the blue, said, Joe, by the way, what are you doing about that music you promised you would write? I said, what music? She said, well, we're in Halifax, and they asked you to write more music. And I said, well, yeah, I know. I said, yes, but only because they just were so insistent. I had to say something, you know. Well, she implied, well, isn't that sort of a commitment, though? And at that point, I realized, busted, you know.
Yeah.
So I immediately started doing a bunch of research, and I got into it. I mean, the book that was really helpful is called The Spirit of Africville, which is a book by Formac Publishing, and it was commissioned by the Africville Genealogy Society. And there's so much wonderful information in it, things I didn't realize. I mean, you know, the stories of Africville, including Duke Ellington, Joe Louis, the heavyweight champion of the world from 1947 to, wait a minute, maybe it was, I don't have the dates exactly, but he was a heavyweight champion for about 10 years, you know. And he had occasion to visit the community of Africville. I found out about, Portia White, who actually performed at Carnegie Hall in the concert hall, and there were just so many wonderful stories. I mean, I got really totally engrossed with it. The fact that here's this community set up by sort of my forebears, Frederick Brown and John, I believe their names. They founded the community around 1848 and invited a lot of citizens who were working in Halifax but living in places like Hammond's Plain and Lucasville and whatnot to have a place to come into town, because I mean they would have to commute, by wagon and horse daily. It was a lot of commuting time, so it was, it was considered like, why don't you live here? You'd be close to where you work, And these, my grandfather, my paternal grandfather, James Arthur Seeley, was in the Merchant Marines from Christchurch, Barbados, and he married Loretta Brown, who was a descendant of the community founders. So I have that connection there too. Yeah, it was great. And once I got into the story, my mind just started working, and I created a piece. I found out that Reverend Deacon Jones was a very popular deacon in the church, and he replaced a rotten fence post with a green post, which grew into a beautiful tree. And every spring, this tree would sprout these wonderful leaves, in the middle of his fence, and the caterpillars every spring would devour every leaf. And yet that tree survived for years, and I thought it was a story that reminded me of the resilience of the community itself, because, they were pretty downtrodden. They weren't considered, in the city of Halifax, they were a lot of times really not welcome,
Yes.
It was considered a slum, and people, they were treated like second-class citizens, and the road really is the old Campbell Road, the piece that I wrote, the road, which is the road that is at the north end of Barrington Street, and it leads into the community of Africville. And the road, the piece itself that I wrote is, it's an anthem to the fact that, when the citizens of Africville, got to this road, they realized they're going home, and they could be all they could be in this wonderful place that they called home. And even though the home itself was not really treasured by the city of Halifax,
Mm-hmm.
To give you an example, here's a community that is thriving, that the residents paid taxes, and yet the city never provided running water or sewer systems or even paved roads. They paid their taxes. I mean, they were good citizens. There was very little unemployment in the community, but there was a spirit. I mean, people didn't lock their doors. There was either a piano or an organ in almost every home. It was a very beautiful, vibrant community. And yet, what did they do? They put a hospital for certain diseases beside it. A garbage dump was placed right beside it. And railroad tracks. They ran two separate railroad tracks right through the middle of the community. Which was about the only thing that was kind of positive, because being a railroad porter was probably the best job that a black person could get at that time.
Tell me about that, because I've learned here living in Toronto about the importance of the railroad, and so many young blacks, for a lot of them, the biggest job you could get back then was being a railroad porter. Did you have family with experience with that?
Oh, did I? Dad was a railroad porter. I mean, through that job that he had, he got to travel all across Canada. And also he managed to buy some land and build a home for us, and, on his salary and his tips, being a railroad porter. But of course, in those days, being a railroad porter, you had to watch your P's and Q's, because any complaints could get you fired. So they became the greatest diplomats. I mean, if I have any diplomacy about me, it's from my father, because he would counter something that was really an insult with sort of a verbal time bomb, which would sound innocent until the person a couple of days later said, "What did that porter say to me?" and they would unravel the fact that he had insulted them in the nicest possible way. So, but at the same time, I got an education. I was able to go to university, and my mom worked as well. She did domestic work, and my father worked on the railroad. And between the two of them, I really never lacked for anything.
Now, you were born in Montreal, in Quebec, and, you later went to Halifax. I believe you went to Halifax in 1967.
Exactly.
But what was life like for you growing up in Quebec? Because one of the interesting stories I learned is that you were taught by the great Daisy Peterson Sweeney to play the piano.
She was one of my teachers. Yeah, she's just one of them. I studied with her for a year. And then the next, when I was old enough to go into Montreal by myself, because we lived on the South Shore, Daisy taught me, and she was great. I mean, she's just a historic figure as far as I'm concerned. I mean,
Absolutely.
I'd be going for my lesson, and she'd be in the kitchen cooking, and I would be playing something, and she said, "That's a B flat, Joey."
But you weren't the only one that she taught. The stuff I've read, now there's a street named after her. She's celebrated. She also taught Oscar how to play. I mean, what was that?
No, she didn't teach Oscar. Oscar knew how to play.
Oh, he knew how to play.
Himself. Yeah. Oh,
okay.
yeah. Oscar was a phenom. I mean, Oscar was born, and just my opinion, with an inordinate amount of natural talent. I mean, first of all, I saw Oscar's hands. I've shook hands with him, and his fingers stretch another inch further than mine did. So he could reach things on the piano that I could only dream of. But, just because you've got natural ability doesn't mean that you're going to be successful. He also, for example, he was studying, and he would have lessons to do, and he wouldn't even practice all week. When it came time to demonstrate what he had learned, he just played it. That's it.
Wow.
He was busy
Wow.
doing other things, you know. He had a lot of natural talent, but what I admire about him, he didn't rest on his laurels. He took that natural talent to a level that we have rarely seen. I mean, he took it to an astronomical level. The natural talent alone ain't going to get you, you know, make you a great musician. You've got to use that talent and develop it and push the envelope, stretch the envelope as far as you can. And he certainly did. I mean, he was a phenomenal musician, a phenomenal musician.
And I heard the great Duke Ellington was waxing poetic about Oscar's skills on the piano as well.
Oh, for sure. Yeah. Duke Ellington, how could you not? You know, I mean, people like Herbie Hancock, you know, admired Oscar Peterson. Even Billy Joel admired. He said, when I was a kid, I used to listen to Oscar Peterson. You know, late at night, my parents would tell me to shut that music off and get some sleep. And he was a great admirer of Oscar Peterson. And this young Jean-Baptiste, this young guy, you know, who is now Oscar winner and whatnot, and was music director for one of the late night talk shows in the States, you know, he did a tribute to Oscar as well. You know, I mean, he'll sit down and say, I don't know how he did things like this. And of course, he would do it. But he said, you know, the inspiration was definitely Oscar. Yeah, for sure.
Now, tell me about the early part of your career. You started, you know, playing in the late 50s, I'm told. What was that like?
Well, you know, well, when I was in grade 8, I ran into a couple of musicians, one by the name of particular Ian Henstridge, who was a bass player, a young bass player, and a trombone player. And he approached me because he thought I looked like a young Charlie Parker. At that point, I only knew about Charlie Parker by name, you know.
Okay.
And he said, do you play an instrument? You know, I said, yeah, I play some. Oh, what do you play? Well, I play my lessons, you know, and I do some duets. My father played at a C melody saxophone. We would do some duets together, you know, very basic stuff.
Nice.
So Ian said, do you know the blues? I said, no, not really. And he looked at me in disbelief, you know, and he shook his head and said, well, let's hang out anyway. And that's what started my whole, I had been to, I don't know if I'd been to Jazz at the Phil, because Dad used to take me to Jazz at the Phil at the Montreal Forum every year, which was like a 3-ring circus of jazz. And I think that my first introduction to really listening to jazz seriously was with Ian. We would dissect vocal harmonies, and I would learn songs, and of course I learned the blues changes and whatnot. And that piqued my interest, and it developed my ear for listening to harmony and things like that. And I think it's still one of my strong points is I've got a good ear for harmony. Anyway, to make a long story short, while I was in university, Ian and his brother Wallace, who we called him Wimp, saxophone player, had taken a job in Val d'Or, Quebec. And their piano player was, I remember, a young prodigy in Montreal, Leroy Falana, had left the job. You know, I just finished my first year university exams, and Leroy had fallen for a dancer and gone up to the next town and left the band in a lurch. So they needed a piano player, and even though I didn't really have any professional experience, I had been playing, you know, with the group, and so he said, why don't you come up to Val d'Or? There's a job for you. You know, I don't know, man. It was 328 miles, and I had to take a bus. And I was living with my dad at the time, and he was on the road. And so I said, okay, why not? You know, adventure, live. I left him a note. I've gone to Val d'Or. I just turned 17.
I can imagine his reaction to that.
Yeah, Val d'Or. Well, the first letter he sent me was, "I'll be up to see you." And then the next letter said, I just checked the map, so I guess you're on your own.
Do you remember your first record?
I think the first record I did was while I was living in Montreal. Pardon me, I was living in Halifax. I got CBC asked me to come to Montreal. They would like to record me because I'd been, doing stuff on air and whatnot, and radio shows and things like that. And I was very busy in Halifax. I was busier than I'd ever been in my life to that point. I was doing TV, the Music Hop Show, and doing CBC radio shows every week and specials, and so they invited me to bring a trio to Montreal to record for RCA Victor for the CBC. And that was my first recording. And of course, I'd never been in a recording session for a record, to do a record. And it was kind of awkward. We were all kind of uneasy about the whole thing. And the first couple hours, it was just a bust, we just couldn't get it together. And then finally, I don't know, I think it was a little tune that I call the Early Morning Blues that we played, and it gelled. And all of a sudden, we knew what it felt like when it was going well. And so we had a bass. And then we did the rest of the album, and things went pretty well, So that was my first recording. And actually, it wasn't my first recording. The first recording I ever did was when I was living in Montreal. I got involved with a show called was it Ebony and Rhythm? Yeah, and we were going to be a touring show, and had dancers and singers and comedians and whatnot. Vern Isaac was the musical director, and Linton Gardner was also involved in it. There was a South American singer. I'm trying to remember her name, and a comedian, a little guy that that was built like Mr. 5x5, as wide as he was tall, but he could do splits and backflips. So it was quite a unique experience. So I was on that album. I was hired to play B3 organ. B3 Hammond, B3 organ, and I sang a song, and I think it was the second time around, on the album, and I did a few other little things. So that was my very first recording, but that was for RCA Victor, that was pretty good. The tour never really happened. We had to get as far as Vancouver. So the agent had to get us to Vancouver, and then from Vancouver, our flights and everything would be paid to Europe or Japan or wherever the heck we were supposed to be going. But we unfortunately didn't get that far. I think we did to Winnipeg, and then we came back to Ottawa, and then the tour sort of faded because we couldn't get the funding to get across Canada. There was quite a few people, probably 12 or 15 people in the troupe, and even though airfares were a lot cheaper than they are now, that was still a lot of money for the time.
Now, the research I've done, Joe, doesn't talk about you being a vocalist. What happened there?
I've never really aspired to be a vocalist, so I've been on occasion, coerced into vocalizing.
Coerced?
Yeah. Because, look, playing piano is hard enough. Singing is, come on, that's another instrument,
Right.
But I finally did. I actually did an album with George Kohler and Cindy Church called The Nearness of You, which was a tribute to Hoagie Carmichael. And nice. So I had to do quite a bit of singing in that,
But you abandoned it.
Oh yeah, at the first opportunity not to sing, I take, because I have such respect for good singers, and I can fake it, but I don't like to fake things. I like to do them right, and I don't have the time or the aspiration to do the type of vocal work I need to do to consider myself a great vocalist.
I want to talk about you and Jackie Richardson, but I want to come back to Halifax. Mm-hmm. Was that your decision to move to Halifax when you did at the time?
Yeah, I was, you see, another part of my life, while I was living in Montreal, going to university and gigging around the province, I was I was working all the time. As a matter of fact, my university studies suffered because I was gigging so much, you know.
Mhm.
And I realized that and yet the kind of jobs I did were working, you know, little towns around Quebec, and I thought there's got to be more in life to this than this. And I realized that for me to advance, I needed discipline, and self-discipline wasn't a high point of my life, you know, at that point, 17, 18, 19 years of age. So I made a really radical decision. I need discipline, and so I'm going to put myself in a situation where discipline is involved. I joined.
What did you do? What did you do?
I joined the Royal Canadian Navy.
What?
Yeah, I did. That was the Navy. Yeah. My dad always said, you know, Joe, my dad was very supportive, but he said, look, musicians can be a tough life. So if you want to pursue a life in music, then you should have something to fall back on. And I thought about that. And so, because Dad always thought that he would like me to be either a preacher or a doctor. He says, preachers always work, and so do doctors, you know. And so I said, well, all right. I joined the Navy, and I said, well, what do you do? I said, well, I play, but I don't want to be in the band. I want to be in the medical branch. So, well, your marks are fine. You want to be in the medical branch? Fine. So I came in, and I joined the Navy. And after basic training, they sent me to the West Coast, to Victoria, BC, to study at their medical facility there. And when I came back to Halifax, I was in the medical branch, and I did all that stuff, you know, basic stuff, you know, and on the wards and even on ambulance duty and things like that. And I've lost my train of thought. All right, yeah. So anyway, I joined because they had a new plan. You join for 3 years instead of 5, you know. And so I thought, okay, 3 years I can handle if I can get my medical training. Well, once I got in there, I realized that you're not going to get any further medical training, because I thought if I've got my X-ray, lab X-ray papers, or X-ray papers, or lab technician, because that would be enough to fall back on. I could work anywhere. Well, they wouldn't give me that training until I signed on for another 5 years.
Oh boy!
Like bait and switch.
Yes, yes.
And I said, no way am I going to sign on for another 5 years. So that's when I decided. And how I got out of the Navy is I enrolled. First of all, I'd quit the union, but I was still gigging in Halifax, and that's a whole other story. But I went back to Montreal and rejoined the. Oh yeah, that's how I got to work in Halifax. I rejoined the Montreal Musician Union and transferred to Halifax until I found out that at that time armed service people weren't allowed to join the Halifax Musicians Union unless they lived there, you know, or. Wow. Had been there before. So yeah. I got busted one New Year's Eve, and that's when I decided, you know, the unions, local musicians were complaining because I was working there, and they knew I wasn't local. So they kept assuming I was in the band, you know, in the band. And so the union would phone the band, do you have a Joe Seeley there? No. They knew what was going on, but they weren't lying. He's not in the band. So finally, one day, what got me busted in Halifax, I was on ambulance duty, and I was wearing my hospital whites with the jacket and my Navy hat, and somebody must have seen me, and he said, he's in the band. So they phoned the union and said, he's in the band, you know, and he's in the medical branch. So of course, I got a letter on New Year's Eve of what year was that? 1960, I think it was, New Year's Eve, saying you forthwith no longer to do gigs in the city. They couldn't stop me. Yeah, they couldn't. I wasn't allowed to gig anymore. So that's when I decided, okay, I'm not going to, if I can't at least do musical jobs in Halifax, I'm going to get out as soon as I can. So I went back to Montreal, and I wrote the entrance exam for Berklee College of Music in Boston and got accepted. And the good thing about being in the medical branch that all my divisional officers were doctors. And so I could say, well, I appreciate, Her Majesty's service. It's been wonderful for me, but I'm not going to continue. And my real goal in life is to be the best musician that I can. And I've been accepted at the School of Music. So I want to be released. And so they said, that makes sense. And I was out 6 weeks later. I got my release, an honorable release. And it was at a time, 61 I was one of the last releases that was granted because it was a time of the Cuban Missile Crisis, which you know about. Yeah, and Russia was loading cruise missiles into Cuba, and the United States weren't having anything to do.
They weren't having it. They weren't
having it. So mine was one of the last releases before they shut down everything for almost a year because they didn't know what was going to happen.
Wow, that's pretty amazing. Now, while you were in Nova Scotia, you had some success working with CBC, I gather.
Yeah, well, that's what I went to. Basically, why I went to Nova Scotia was to do a television series. And the reason that the band leader asked for me, because he remembered when I used to work with him when I was in the Navy and whatnot. He always wanted me to come back to Halifax to work. So he says, Joe, I have a gig for you, a TV show, And at that time, I was playing in Quebec City with a group called Billy Martin. I was playing Hammond B3, and the Navy band came through. It was Centennial year, 67, and they saw me, they recognized me, and they got back to Halifax and said, Joe Seeley is working in Quebec City now. He's playing Hammond B3 organ. And Keith said, well, I always thought Joe would never leave Montreal. So if he'd leave Montreal to go to Quebec, maybe he'll come to Halifax. And they needed a piano player for the TV show. So Keith got my number and called me and offered me the job. And, basically the TV show was basically paying me about what I was making anyway. But, to go to one situation for the same. And I said, well, let me think about it. Then a week later, he called me and says, I can guarantee you a radio show every week as well. So all of a sudden the ante was up. And once again, my spirit of adventure was awakened. And New Year's Eve day in 1967, I jumped in my car and drove through a snowstorm to Halifax, Nova Scotia to start my new maritime adventure.
And how long you spent? About 10 years there?
9 years.
9 years.
Yeah, 9.5 years. Yeah. Oh, yeah. I loved it. Yeah.
That's what I was going to ask you because, Montreal is a very different city than Halifax, Nova Scotia.
Right. But I was on TV.
Of course.
So in a whole other category, I mean, people walk down the street and stop. Yeah, don't I see you on TV? So what a lot of other people of my hue went through, I didn't go through because I was, in a sense, a minor celebrity,
Yes.
And I mean, I used to hear, like black people don't go to this restaurant. So I'd go to the restaurant. And I got served. There was no issue. Anything that black people didn't do, I tried to see what it's like, and I never had any issues at all. Even if people didn't know I was on television,
were you then an activist? Because I do recall the story of you and the great Sammy Davis Jr.
Well, that was in Toronto. Yeah, I was an activist. Sammy was the activist. We're moving way ahead. I moved to Toronto now, and I'm on the job scene. And I put myself out there, and I have to thank a local musician, Bernie Sinensky, for being one who I'd met when he was on tour with the Holiday Inn circuit when in Halifax during the late '60s. Yeah, I met Bernie, and so when I got to Halifax, when I got to Toronto, he knew my playing and whatnot, and so the first thing he did was recommend me to Peter Appleyard, who was, vibraphonist and well respected in the garden, had his TV show and everything. And I started working with Peter Appleyard. And then I got a call out of the blue from the O'Keefe Center, which is now the Meridian Theater. Yes. They wanted a pianist, and Bernie recommended me. But the show was Hello, Dolly. And at that point, I didn't really have much theater experience, So I said, well, it's a foot in the door. And I went there, and I was nervous as hell. I went to the Wednesday matinee where the pianist was the actual assistant conductor. So I got to see the show, and I think he knew I was coming from a jazz background, and he wasn't overly welcoming, So I said, well, here's the book, and you come here on Sunday is when the conductor goes to the next city, and he's going to be conducting, and you're going to play the book. So I went home and I would shed it for days and days and days. I don't practice a lot. For me to practice in more than an hour and a half is rare. Unless I'm really working on something specific. I practice 6 hours a day. And so I went in there, and I sat down, and I was kind of timid, and sitting in the pit playing, and as soon as the first act was over, the assistant conductor came over, and the first thing he did, he lit into me. When there are eighth notes, they are played evenly. Dot 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 dot, not dot 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 dot. Even though I wasn't doing that, but you could tell that. That's
the bias was already there. Yeah.
And so then he said, play this for me. So I played that part. Play this for me. Okay. Don't forget, Carol Chang's up there, and don't mess her up. This was his attitude. So the second act started, and I'm almost devastated. And then fortunately, I got mad. I got so mad. I said, I'm not going to be treated like this by this jerk. And I started playing even louder, and I started slamming out this stuff, And when the show was over, I slammed the book down, and I was walking out, and some of the orchestra members, look, excuse me, do you travel with the show? I said, what? Do I No, I'm just coming in today. Oh, good for you. Are you going to be here? I said, well, I had to do, how I got the job was, I got asked to do the Sammy Davis Jr. show. So Bill McCauley, who was the contractor, said, since I've upset your vacation by you accepting the show, how about doing the last show of Hello, Dolly? Well, can you imagine anything more diverse than working with Sammy Davis Jr. and playing Hello, Dolly, the Broadway musical?
Of course.
If you're a musician, you play music. It's just music. So how can I say, no, I can't do that, but I can do this, So that's what happened. So anyway, I said, actually, I'll be here next week with Sammy Davis Jr.'s show. And they said, oh, good. Well, we'll see you there.
It seems like Sammy had some beef with the way he was covered by a local writer.
Yeah, one of the local, I can't remember the writer's name. He's long gone now, dead and buried. But the writer, instead of commenting on his show, was commenting about his glass eye. And it wasn't a review. It was a personal attack on Sammy Davis Jr. And Sammy swore that he would never play Toronto again. Well, he finally got talked into it. And so when he saw me in the orchestra, the only black face in the orchestra, he said, He says, he says, how would you like to, because before the show comes on, there's another show. I can't remember what it was, but there's another performance that I was playing for because I didn't really have to play for him.
Mm-hmm.
Because he had his own music director. I mean, these guys travel with their own pianists, but because it was a show before, he says, how would you like to do some improvise? Like he would do a talk at the beginning of the show for about 10 minutes, 5 to 10 minutes. And he said, how would you like to do some background music to my talking? And so at the beginning of the show, there's Sammy Davis Jr. and me on stage on piano. And that was his way of being an advocate.
Wow. Any reactions that you recall, or was it all very quiet?
Yeah, it was very quiet. Yeah, he never said anything about it. I knew what was going on. He obviously planned it. And that was it. It was quiet, and we did it.
Amazing. I got to ask you about a musician that you might know about, Cy McLean. I received an email recently of a group here in Toronto that is attempting to get an official plaque honoring Cy McLean.
Yes.
Did you ever cross paths?
No, I didn't. My dad knew him. Yeah, my dad.
Okay.
Because he was of my dad's age, and Dad had heard him play in his band and whatnot. So I was familiar with his name, but I never did meet him. No.
Okay. All right. Let me go back to the album, this seminal album of yours.
Mm-hmm.
I've had the pleasure of seeing you perform that with Jackie, the great Jackie Richardson.
Mm-hmm.
And there are people who tell me that they were moved to tears on some of the tracks from Africville Suite. When did you realize that this was something special? Because it seems to me that this album probably defied even your expectations.
Yeah, I would say yes, absolutely. Yeah, I didn't expect, the accolades that I received from it, And so I started touring a lot through Canada and whatnot. And at that time, it was just the quartet, piano, bass, drums, and sax. And so to introduce the songs, if you see, every song I wrote has a story, And
yes.
The Duke's in town, about Duke's second wife being Mildred Dixon from the community of Africville, and how Duke would on occasion take the train with Mildred to visit her parents and whatnot, and be in the community. So, I mean, these stories started coming out, and that's how, that was the inspiration for most of the music that I wrote, was based on stories about the community,
Mm-hmm.
Kildare's Field was a play area for the children, and at the edge of it, you went down a little slope, and then you were right on the Bedford Basin, so they could play sports and then jump in Bedford Basin and swim. I mean, try to do that in Toronto.
But River of Dreams.
Uh-huh.
I see River of Dreams, which is one of my favorites on the album. It says that the lyrics were written by Dan Hill.
Oh yeah, Dan Hill.
How did that come about?
Well, I wrote some pieces of music which I really felt were crying for lyrics, and I didn't know how to ask. And once again, my dear wife said, "Why don't you call Dan Hill?" Really? Called Dan? I knew Dan, but I mean, why would he want to work with me? He was a national star. So I worked up my courage, phoned him up. He says, "Yeah, sounds good. Where do you live? I'll be over."
Just like that.
Just like that. Yeah.
Was he into jazz as well?
Oh yeah, I mean, he was into it. He appreciated it. I mean, he used to come out to hear when Paul and I worked as a duo for years, and it was not unusual for Dan to come out to listen to us. He was very appreciative. And but Dan wrote some great lyrics, especially the opening tune, which is "Deep Down Inside." It quite often when we do now, I should point out right now the distinction between Africville Suite and Africville Stories. Okay, Africville Suite only had two vocals. It had "Deep Down Inside" at the beginning, and in the middle was not leaving home. Yeah, leaving home. Sometimes I Dream, which Dan Hill did the lyrics to. Okay, so actually on the album it was Sharon Lee Williams that sang "Deep Down Inside."
Okay,
and Dutch Robinson sang "Sometimes I Dream," which was the lament about losing Africville. Sometimes I dream a home I once knew on a land called Africville. So I'm touring along, and of course I don't have any vocals, so we're doing everything instrumentally, and I'm telling stories of the music. And it occurred to me that, this could be developed into something a little larger, which is what it is now. It's called Africville Stories, where first of all, I went back to Dan Hill and got him to write some more lyrics for pieces. Another piece I wrote the lyrics to, and I involved a vocalist, which I can't ask for anyone finer than Jackie Richardson if she'd be interested, and she was. And I basically wrote the libretto for the show, which Africville Stories, which sets up the music. And Jackie, in her being the actor that she is, she delivers this libretto to set up the songs, and then quite often she sings them. Well, it's not unusual for the first tune, "Deep Down Inside," to get a standing ovation. I mean, it's not unusual at all. I've toured with the Nathaniel Deck Chorale, where we do her, and at the time, oh God, don't fail me now, another wonderful vocalist, and I'll think of her name in a moment. Almost every time we did a show at one of the universities, the first tune, everyone would be standing at the end of it. Wow. So it is that dramatic. And that sort of sets the mood for the show. And then it goes into other things. And of course, Jackie being the actor that she is, we have moved things around and we've done things that, the show has really been enhanced with dialogue, trains coming. We do sound effects in the back. And Jackie, of course, in her own way, delivers that intro to it. And there's a little bit of a rap type tune that it's developed into in the middle, where she does a rap type thing, based on the railroad experience in Canada and whatnot. So the show is really taking on a whole other dimension. And then when we did it when we do it now, it's Africville Stories, with more songs and more dialogue. Mm-hmm.
Wow. Now, you've also been nominated, for some of your other work that may be somewhat lesser known to the public. And you're also the winner of a Dora Mavor Award in theater.
Yeah, for music direction of musical of Ain't Misbehavin', the Toronto company of it.
And how did that go? You must be proud. Here you are. You're an actor. You're a director, musical director. You're doing all these amazing things.
It was pretty special. I was the on-stage music director. The actual Rick Fox got the original award, but the cast really petitioned for me since I came in for the rehearsals for a couple of weeks. I was there for a year, directing every night, So finally, they acquiesced and gave me a Dora as well. So it was a hard fought award, but I felt it was deserved, and so did everybody else.
Absolutely, absolutely. And you got involved at one point in, more than one theater projects. Can you talk about some of the theater projects that you also were involved in?
Yeah, I got recruited by Salome Bay to play her musical Indigo, which was a big smash hit in Toronto, and I played Indigo for quite a number of months actually, and I've done other things. Sandra O'Neill had a show which she revived from when she had done it in the 80s, called Sweet Reason. I music directed that. And also, I got involved with a show that never really took off because we didn't have the funding, but it's Chappie Johnson and his all-black musical all-stars, or baseball all-stars. It was about the traveling baseball teams who used to come up to the States and tour through Canada in the off-season, and I wrote the music for that. We performed it on stage a couple of times at Hart House in Toronto.
UT.
Yeah, IT. But it was a cast of 13 on a black musical about a baseball team, traveling baseball team. Even though the reception was good, we couldn't get the interim funding we needed to basically produce the thing. So after years of trying and going to different theater companies, I sort of said, okay, I'm just going to put that to rest. But I wrote some great music for it, so I hear, and not my words.
yes.
But there have been a few projects that I've had to abandon,
So having looked back on, what is an amazing career in music, on stage, as an actor, where does acting fit in?
Well, acting. I got into acting in the 90s. Well, first of all, my late wife worked with SCTV, the Second City crew. So I got involved with some of their shows as a musician. They need, the first one was the Fantasy Island scene where I played piano, and at one point I had to get up and go crazy, and so I said, hey, this is interesting. So I got a few other little things like that. I worked on a few of their shows. I actually wrote some music for one of their episodes with Kids in the Hall, called anyhow, I've written some stuff. I got involved with them. So anyway, I decided to take some acting classes. I went to what they call it, Second City School. I did first level, and where you learn to improvise and whatnot. And the trust thing is always fun, where you have to trust people and let yourself fall back, assuming they will catch you. So until that exercise was over, you made sure that nobody disliked you.
Yes.
So anyway, the main thing I did get involved in a movie or two. I did one called Brown Bread Sandwiches, where I had the whole opening scene as a railroad porter, and when I met the director, he basically asked me about myself, and I said, well, my dad was a porter, so I know quite a bit about doing that job. So he said, oh, great, good, you're hired. So the first 10 minutes of the movie, or 5 minutes of the movie, is me, making these sandwiches and interacting with some of the passengers and whatnot. But and I did a lot of TV things, and the reason I wanted to do it was because I wanted to do commercials, and I did a few commercials too. And I liked about commercials, you don't only get paid once, but every 13 weeks, if they redo it, you got residuals. So that was why I wanted to get into acting. Not that I wanted to really be an actor, but actor enough to get commercials,
There you go. There you go. And what some people might not know, and I know we've been here with you for a while, so we're going to try and wrap up in short order, is your show in Jazz FM. Can you talk about that?
Well, that's something. Yeah, it started many years ago. I don't know. I've been with Jazz FM for, I have to guess, 14 or 15 years. At that point, at one point, Bill King was producing the show, and he asked me if I'd be willing to host the show, which was called Joe Seeley Duets, where I would actually perform with guests and also interview them. So I did that for a couple of years, and then that, I don't know, budget sort of, it gets harder and harder to get, touring musicians to come in and participate on a radio show unless they happen to be in town anyway. But that, at one day, they said, well, how would you like to just do your own radio show? And I got together with, Bill and Ross Porter at the time, and I think Brad from Jazz FM, and they asked me if I'd like to do a radio show, and I said, well, I said, okay. By that time, I was sort of used to being on the air. I said, these are my things that I would insist upon, and they agreed to it, and I've been doing it ever since. And it's called Joe's Jazz. I'm on Monday nights at 9 o'clock for an hour. And basically, I play a selection of the jazz music that I find interesting. And I basically introduce them. And, I've only got an hour, so it's basically 9 pieces with a little bit of introduction and comments, from me. And so it's been fun, I get to do.
And it's quite the master class for a lot of people who, may wonder, okay, who were your influences? What are you listening to? All of that.
Yeah. And the other thing is, I said, I don't want to go back into the archives. I'm not going to do Louis Armstrong. I'm not going to do Miles Davis and John Coltrane. Everybody's done that. I said, my show basically covers musicians from the 1990s till today. Okay.
Wow.
Yeah, and that's it. So I don't play the jazz legends who are my heroes, but I want my show to be more contemporary. And I do some stuff that, I introduce things that I find interesting that aren't necessarily down the straight line of jazz either,
Well, I think as someone who listens to jazz and various forms of music, I think that's what's missing because, a lot of people just go for the greats and that's it.
Yeah.
And after a while, that can become quite boring.
Well, yeah, it's so ubiquitous. I mean, it's everywhere,
Yeah.
And I play a lot of local musicians, the ones that I find that are really doing things that I'm impressed with. I mean,
yes.
There are a lot of fine musicians, and some I choose to put on my show, and others I don't. And the ones I choose, I was asked by that. Well, how do you determine which ones you're going to play? Mm-hmm. And I guess the simplest thing is the ones that I would listen to more than once. That I would choose to listen to more than once. Not that they're not great, but if they don't really grab me, I mean, everybody, let's face it, everybody plays great, but if you give me a quartet and they play great, but I'm not moved by anything. I don't find anything special about it. It's just another quartet playing great. But all of a sudden, somebody comes up with an arrangement that picks up my ears. What are they doing? That's what I lean into.
And that's why so many people tune in on Monday nights. So keep doing it. We're benefiting from it, and the local musicians love you for it, because to be able to get your attention and have you say this is a great record, I mean, that's golden.
Well, for my limited exposure, I suppose it is. Yeah, but of course, when you consider when you're on an internet, you really have a worldwide exposure for anyone who finds you.
Right. And you have that too.
Yeah, well, I hope so.
All right. So I think we're going to wrap it up here. And I really, really want to thank you, Joe, for being the special person that you are. As a musician, as a composer, as an actor, and being involved with some, seminal theatrical productions in the city. And you continue to amaze us. And we hope that there's some new things on the way. I know when I saw you at the Kensington Jazz, I think you mentioned that there might be more performances down the road?
Oh, yeah, we have one more Africville Stories concert coming on in Kitchener on the 29th of November. Yeah, that's going to be good. Yeah.
Okay. So if people want to know more about you, your website is?
I have joseely.com. I don't really keep up with posting a lot of things that I do, and you'll get your basic information from it.
Okay.
joseely.com. Yeah.
All right. Okay. So, Mr. Seeley, thank you so much. I appreciate this opportunity to speak with you, and we really appreciate the time, the energy, and the success that you've had. You've been a shining light for a lot of younger jazz musicians, and all the best.
I thank you for your interest and the great job that you do as well.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you.